Welcome to this edition of CBAN's Lunch and Learn, the June 2021 edition. I am Curtis Dean with CBAN, and we're really excited about today's topic as we're going to be taking a look at a few of the states here in the USA that have state broadband programs and the various approaches that they are taking for those programs. So I'll do an introduction to our guests here in just a moment. We are doing our event a little bit differently this time around, as we are actually putting this out live on our YouTube page and also on Facebook. So if you are watching live on YouTube or on Facebook, your way to participate in today's discussion is to just type a comment in the chat window in the comment section of either YouTube or on the YouTube channel or on Facebook. And we'll be able to read those comments and share those with our guests. And if you have any questions or comments that you have, just feel free to pop those on whenever you have, and we'll be monitoring those as we go along. I want to give a little shout out to the newest associate member of CBAN, Vitro Fiber Maps. They just joined last week, and they are a company that provides a lot of mapping resources for broadband providers, and we're excited to have them on as a CBAN associate member. So welcome to Vitro Fiber Maps, and we thank them for their support. I'll bring in Todd Kielkopf. Todd is CBAN co-founder and co-host today. And want to also welcome in, we have two of our three guests are online. We're hoping our third will join us. But first of all, this is Matt Behrens, and Matt is the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO, for the state of Iowa. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
And also Peggy, is it Schaffer or Schaffer, Peggy?
Schaffer.
Schaffer. Okay, great. And you're with Connect Maine, and you play the role as the director of the Connect Maine program.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you both for coming on. I appreciate your time today. There's been so much attention paid to broadband in the past few years, and really the past 18 months, it's just been like a bright light shown on the importance of broadband and better broadband in rural America and even in urban America, as COVID drove people home, forced them to work remotely, learn remotely, receive health care remotely. And so as a result of that, we've seen a lot of responses on the federal level and even in the states about how to respond to fill any broadband gaps there are in. Now, Maine and Iowa are both the two states that have had programs that have been established for some period of time. So I want to start, first of all, with you, Peggy. Talk a little bit about Connect Maine, and how did your program get established and when?
So Connect Maine is a public instrumentality of the state. We're a quasi-independent agency. We were established in 2006 as a result of the legislative activity and understanding the importance of broadband back in 2006. We're funded with a small assessment, essentially on landlines, which is a declining revenue stream. And we do basically two main programs, which is one is an infrastructure program where we help communities and internet service providers bring better broadband to an area, and we do community planning grants, which are little bits of money to help communities sort of get their act together so they can identify sort of what solution they want and what partner ISP that they would like to work with, and how they can get that network funded.
Matt, talk to us a little bit about the state of Iowa's program, not only the broadband grant program, but how that fits into the larger Empower Iowa campaign.
Sure. So the broadband program was established in around 2015. And to your earlier point, Curtis, about kind of the growth in this, when we started, the earliest projects that we were working on were kind of small property tax exemption programs for telecommunication providers. And then I think our first grant was for $1.3 million. And sort of fast forward from then, last year we did a $50 million opportunity through federal funds that were available to the state. And we're preparing now for a $100 million opportunity to be available in July. We've contextualized broadband, or Governor Reynolds has, inside of a broader Empower Rural Iowa program, which has a lot of different components to it. But really the goal is, how can we use broadband to begin to help revitalize and grow rural areas? We see this not as a technology a policy effort so much as an opportunity to help increase participation in rural areas that haven't been served in the past, and all those things that we use the internet for. And that did come to a head for us, of course, during the pandemic, where we were really focused on ways to extend, distance learning, telehealth, telework opportunities to all Iowans, not just those who were in urban areas who had good service already. So that's kind of the foundation for the program. And thinking about as we go forward, that outreach in rural areas will continue.
So much of the, so many of the state broadband programs and indeed federal broadband programs have had to, as a necessity, focus on mapping. In other words, trying to figure out where broadband exists today, where it doesn't exist today, so you have an idea of where investments might need to be made. Peggy, I'll maybe start with you a little bit. What approach has the state of Maine taken to mapping efforts in your state? Whoops.
Working directly with ISPs to get better data. So essentially, we ask the ISPs in a confidential manner to provide us with data that we then map to the street level. It's not perfect. It's a little better than FCC data, but not much. This past year, we started a speed testing program, which is a statewide program that individuals can go online and test their speed. It gets posted to a public map, and it gives us an additional piece of information about where service is and where service isn't. It's sort of a key element of our community planning activity, where the community sort of uses this process to identify where gaps are in their community for service, and then can develop better solutions to fill those gaps. But it really is a street level look, which the federal data is not, at where the problems are that can help us figure out where we should be working to solve these issues.
Great. It looks like Antonio from the Colorado Broadband office is attempting to join us. Can you hear us, Antonio? I think you're muted on your end. We'll come back to you when it looks like you got everything ready to go here. Peggy, I just wanted to come back to you for just a second. You're starting with mapping information based on what providers are telling you. Is that coming directly from them, or are you capturing the FCC Form 477 reports?
So our broadband availability map uses a combination of the two. It's the base is the FCC 477, and then we ask providers to give us much more specific information. Some do, and some don't. And then that adds to the richness, shall we say, of our broadband availability map.
What are the reasons that you receive or hear from providers about why maybe they aren't forthcoming with that information?
They don't want to give it to us.
Is it they just don't want the competition to find out, or they just don't really want to show their cards? Our data is shielded. In other words, so when you click on a spot, unless you're the only provider, and I will say that the people who are the only provider, or one of the people who are, which is our big incumbent telephone company, they've provided us with the data. So unless you're the only provider in an area, you are conglomerated with all the providers that are in that area. So you don't, when you click on a spot, you can see the providers in the column. You don't know exactly which one runs by your house. So it's not information the FCC requires. We ask for it, and it's optional for them to deliver it. We have actually just changed our rule this year that says if they don't provide it, we're not going to give them a grant. And so we'll see if this year makes a difference in terms of what they report to us. Some of it also is, they don't really have this information. I mean, when we think they do have this information, but they don't really have it to the street level. When we call them and say, hey, if you have somebody in some town that wants to get connected because they don't have service, they often will say, oh, we'll have to get back to you on that. And they have to look it up. And so it's not, if you think about how these providers compile data, it's not to report to us or to the FCC about who's served and what's served. It's really about what their network is and where their customers are. And so the data is not exactly the same. And so it really is an extra step for them to do it. Well, I'm going to turn to you for just a second, Matt. Of course, mapping is just as big of a deal here in Iowa, and your office is going through a pretty big effort right now to kind of redo the maps based on the most recent legislation and the most recent tranche of funding. So talk about that process.
Yeah, we're right in the middle of it as we speak. And the bill that Governor Reynolds signed this year really began to reshape how we think about eligibility in the state. I think that was one of the core things that it did. We're still looking at the census block level, although we're doing a lot of the things that they're doing in Maine in terms of direct data gathering from providers. And we, in certain circumstances, are getting road segments and things like that are much more granular. But then we package that up into the census block layer. And so we look all across the state, all 216,000 census blocks, with all the data that we've gathered, a combination of provider data and FCC data. We then make designations concerning eligibility. And what's new this year is, in the past, for the past 3 or 5 years in the state, we've had a census block as either a targeted service area or it's not. And targeted service areas are eligible to receive incentives under our programs, and non-targeted service areas are not. And that distinction was based on whether or not 25 through service was present. And so that's been revised in small little ways over the years, but then this year the new legislation really changes the model. So we have different tiers. So we have a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 targeted service area effectively. And those tiers are based on the speed levels that are there. Tier 1 targeted service areas, there's nothing. So it's below 25/3. And then we go progressively up in tier 2 and tier 3. And the reason that matters is the incentives that are available to the state change with those tiers. So the TSAs where service is most desperately needed, the tier 1 TSAs, they're eligible to receive a 75% match. Tier 2, where there's a little bit of service, it's faster, but it's not the fastest speeds, it's a 50% match. And then tier 3, 35% match. And then the other thing we're doing, of course, in addition to that eligibility piece, is really looking at new build-out speed levels and thresholds. But we can certainly get into that if you're interested as well.
That process that you're going through, it's kind of probably, I would imagine it's all hands on deck for your office at this point. Because, we're given a fairly short window to redo these maps and release these new rules.
Yeah, it's definitely a busy time for us. And so, fortunately, this is, we're no longer kind of new at this. So we've had 5 prior grant rounds, so we kind of know what we need to do. But of course, every time the program changes in legislation, we have to go back and rethink the underlying components that we're going to put in place. And that includes both the guidelines for the grant, the way we gather data and request it from applicants. And so that does take an enormous amount of preparation on our part to get all those pieces put together.
Peggy, how have the definitions changed for your main program? Are you still basically echoing the FCC's definition of broadband at 25/3? Have you gone and have you tiered it kind of like what Iowa has done, or how have you handled that?
So about 3 or 4 years ago, we upped our unserved from essentially nothing over nothing to 25/3. We've had a build standard for about 5 years, which is what you have to build to, of 10/10. Just last week at a board meeting, we changed the definition of broadband to 100/100 and changed the definition of unserved to 50/10. And we have not done a tiered method like that officially, but we're going to include that in our grant process and our scoring process, so that if you start with really bad speeds, you're going to score higher than people with better speeds. So that way the money flows through a scoring competitive process to the areas that apply, that have the worst service. And so that's how we're thinking about the tier method. It's not I think as formal as Iowa's is, and probably not as formal as the industry would like, but it will provide that same kind of strategy where the people with the worst service score better and are therefore more likely to get a grant.
I know there's been a lot of discussion about with different programs wanting to make those, especially grant funding programs, to make them technology neutral. I would imagine that's getting harder to do when certain types of technology are just more capable of meeting certain minimum speeds than other types of technologies. Has that been a, been a topic of discussion at either of your offices? And maybe I'll start with you, Matt.
Yeah, it's definitely been a topic of discussion. And I think it's It certainly has. We believe, I think, fundamentally, two things that can sometimes be in tension with each other. First time, we believe that we need to be building to the highest standards possible. We believe that 100 is the future. It's future-ready capability, and it's going to provide the kind of the roadway for years to come. That being said, we know that fiber optics, which is the most capable technology for delivering some of those speeds at the present time, isn't going to make it to every location in the state. Some of those areas that are unserved are too difficult, challenging, expensive to serve with fiber. That's why they don't have it today. And we understand that the journey to get to fiber in those locations may take time. The legislation that was passed this year and Governor Reynolds signed provides an affordance for that consideration. And so there is the capability while our standard build-out requirement is 100, there is an exception for those difficult to serve areas where build-out can be at 120. And we believe there are some wireless products that are probably capable of meeting that build-out speed. So we think it'll be a combination of those things. And we're very careful to say that this problem's long-term solution isn't one thing. It's probably a lot of different things. And so we're still trying to prioritize that message as best we can.
These are all competitive programs, funding programs, right? I see you both nodding your head here. If you have for example, two entities bidding on support for the same area, and one tells you, I can't make this work at 100 by 100, but I can do 100 by 20. And then you have another applicant that says, I can do this at 100 by 100. In both cases, do those get weighed so that the 100 by 100 bidder is more likely to get that funding, or how do you handle that?
If I can speak for Iowa,
Yeah.
We're the notice of funding availability that we've published on our website articulates kind of the methodology through which we'll organize the ranking. Step number one is we take in the raw data and we provide a quantitative aggregate score for each applicant. Those are rank ordered. Now, in a scenario where two applicants are competing for the same block and one applicant will offer 100 and the other will offer 120, the first cut at this is the rank order. If the 100 applicant ranks higher, they'll be awarded the block. Now, if the 120 applicant ranks higher and there's a lower ranking 100 applicant who's above the money line, we will then award that block to the 100 applicant in the interest of getting the fastest speed there.
Great. Todd, I'm going to make sure you can talk too if you want to. We're talking about mapping, talking about funding. Now, in both of your cases, it looks like we're not going to be able to get Antonio from Colorado on at this point, unfortunately. Probably his internet's down. But when you're looking at the funding in both states, is it primarily or exclusively to last mile networks, or are you also providing support or funding to middle mile projects?
We generally do. We have been doing, we don't have a lot of funding, right? So we have $1.5 million a year, which doesn't build a lot. We just got this past summer, the legislature and then the public voted on a general fund bond issue for $15 million. We generally fund last mile networks. We have used federal funds in the past. We used the ARPA money to build out a fairly fat 3-5 petabyte line that runs essentially around the state. And that's a good, strong middle mile. We have just actually put a new, just passed this week, a new Connect Authority in place, which will have the ability to build, fund, and potentially own middle mile. So we are looking at middle mile. Part of our strategy here is we're trying to figure out, when we get to the end, how we make this service affordable to people to use it. So, when you think about broadband, there's a couple things that need to happen. You need to have a wire running by your house. You need to be able to afford the service. You need to have a device. You need to know how to use that device. And so we're trying to figure out, rather than do with the emergency broadband benefit the FCC put in place, which is just keep putting money at the end, if we can figure out how to lower the cost all the way down the line so that when you get to the end, the price of service can be lower. That's one of the reasons we're looking at a middle mile strategy to see if there's ways that we can lower the cost of a build, so that you can charge customers less on the end so that it can be a more affordable network. So we don't do middle mile now, but we will be.
Is that a similar story with you, Matt, in Iowa?
Yeah, I mean, I think that how I would characterize our program is it's really focused on end user delivery. So
Yeah.
we're interested in that last mile piece. However, we're going to measure outcomes. So you tell us what your project's going to cost, and then we're going to want to see the number of homes and the number of schools and the number of businesses you facilitate service to. And if you include a middle mile component in that project, we'll accept that as part of the grant, so long as you're serving those end users at the end of the day when the project is done.
Well, I want to get Antonio on here while we have him. We want to welcome Antonio Martinez. He's Executive Director of Colorado Broadband. Antonio, thanks for joining us. Sorry you might have had some snags getting on this afternoon.
Thank you, Curtis. Actually, I was in an executive meeting and I just got out of it late, and I've never used this platform before, so I'm it's kind of a learning process for me. But
believe it or not, it still is for us as well.
Great. So I'll give some in brevity some discussion on Colorado's broadband office.
Yes, please.
Not every state right now has a full-blown broadband office that does the functions that my office does, but we do several different key things that are very important to our state. One, we recognize that we have a lack of broadband, especially in the rural parts of our state. And unlike many states, we have that beautiful thing called the Rocky Mountains, which is very difficult terrain to traverse with fiber or any type of signal. So it makes it very challenging. So we focus, like many of the other states, primarily on GIS and mapping and getting a feeling for where all of our providers are and working basically public-private engagements so that we're working with each other to say, hey, can you realistically invest in this area? Another part of my office is also based on data and data analytics. I've got some pretty solid team members that know how to look at different areas and try to bring that data to our different boards. Colorado uniquely has two different broadband boards. We have a broadband advisory board, which is highly open to the public for comment as well as service providers. Then we have a broadband deployment board, which focuses specific grant dollars into different areas to try to incentivize industry to build out plant. And that tends to focus on areas that are unserved or underserved. So that's been one of our good fortunes over the last several years, is to invest millions of dollars in that direction. Obviously, I don't have to tell you all, but now with a lot of the federal funding options that have come forward, we're able to try to incentivize our citizens and our companies to try to apply for that federal funding and try to invest it across the state. So that's been very, very useful for us. We also have a very strong personal and customer relations side of our team. We work locally with many of our communities, a lot of our political action groups, a lot of our tribal areas in order to engage them and get a feel for what they are feeling for broadband and where the needs are and how we can focus state and federal resources in order to help better provide services to them. So we have a lot of different things that are going on at any given time within our team. And so that's very important. Last year, we brought on our own federal programs person that does nothing but track the different program dollars out of Washington and how Colorado can be eligible to apply for them. We make sure to keep that information public. We do a lot of public service type of work, public service announcements, public service engagements, and make sure to share all the information that we have collectively from the different federal agencies that provide funding, such as the FCC or USDA for some of our states, NTIA. We have a lot of different entities, Commerce, for example, that have funding that we can basically try to target. And then the last thing I do that I think is important for all of you from different states is benchmarking. I always make sure that whatever federal data is available, that I take a look at where my state is and how we're doing compared to all y'all states. I want to make sure that we're all competing equitably, but I want to make sure that my state is just as competitive as anybody else. And there are cases where we're not, and there are cases where we are. And those are the areas where I focus my team to try to enhance and improve upon some of our application processes. So that in a nutshell is how our Colorado Broadband office works. We report directly from the governor's office to my executive director. And then, of course, I'm also an executive director. And we work very closely in terms of continual relations with our central budgeting office at the state. It's called OSPB here in Colorado, similar to OMB in Washington. And we work to make sure to try to fence funding in every successive year and work with our legislature to make sure that that funding is available specifically for broadband. Does anybody have any questions for me in terms of Colorado's programs? I think you're muted, Curtis.
I think you're right. That's because I keep coughing and I have to mute myself so I don't bother you guys. Great overview there, Antonio. Does anybody have any questions or comments? one thing I would throw out for Matt and Peggy and Antonio is I would assume that you folks all kind of talk to each other, right? And trying to figure out who's doing it differently, who's doing it, maybe learning from each other, best practices. Do you network with each other with other state broadband programs? How do you handle that flow of information?
So NTIA sponsors a state broadband leaders group, and we also have an email Google group. And so there is a lot of chatter in the group about new ideas and new strategies. Q Trust has been a key element of helping share what states are doing for best practices. I noticed that Benton just came out with a report today on best practices for states. Mm-hmm. So we absolutely talk to each other, commiserate with each other, and learn from each other. I was just on a call last week where Matt Schmidt from Illinois, who's got a $400 million program, has been working with the Heartland Foundation on developing what they call a connected core, which are people who are going to go out and help communities figure out how to do this. And it's a fabulous idea. I'm going to approach some of our nonprofit funders to see if they might be interested in it. But the other piece about that is that we're talking about developing nationally sort of best practices on onboarding these people so they really can be ready to go when they hit communities. And that's the kind of support that we give each other as we try to all work this out, because none of our offices are very big, right? None of us are. I've got 2 people in my office. I think Washington State's got 2, Tennessee's got 2. So none of us are very big. So it's really important that we learn from each other and we build on each other's knowledge and experience.
Because it's not really a competition between states as far as the broadband offices. No. On the other hand, every state wants to advance broadband in its state because it makes its state a more competitive place to live, work, and play. So we've talked about funding a little bit. I know that there's funding available for last mile projects. Antonio, I'm not sure if I asked you to cover that, but is Colorado doing anything for middle mile funding opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So our Department of Local Affairs does specifically the middle mile types of projects, but we also have within the Colorado Department of Transportation an infrastructure beneath many of our highways. We find that to be one of the best ways in order to get, especially across the mountains of Colorado, to make sure we have some connectivity. So that middle mile infrastructure is there, and we continue to build out further in each successive year, depending on the funding we get from the state and or federal governments.
Another area that funding can be very helpful and leverage a lot is funding for planning or studies, where, say, a community wants to be able to invest a little money in figuring out what its plan needs to be, developing that strategic broadband plan. Do any of your programs allow communities to apply for money to, say, do a study?
Yeah, we do. We have 2. We have a planning grant program where we call phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1's a really simple sort of get people together in the community, figure out what it is you have, figure out what it is you want. And then a phase 2 grant really helps them take it to the next step. What is the feasibility? What might a network cost? How might you fund it? What are the components of it? What's your revenue stream going to be from a network that gets built? Is that enough to pay for it? Do you want it to be municipally owned? Do you want to partner with a ISP? Do you want to do both? And that really sets them up for a infrastructure grant, whether they do it with a provider coming in, with the community supporting them, or whether they decide to build their own municipally owned or municipally operated network.
And those are municipalities can be broadband providers in Maine, right? Correct?
Yeah, nobody does it, right?
Right.
But they are interested in owning the infrastructure. So
right.
They will. We have a few communities, it's growing more, who build the infrastructure. They own the infrastructure, but then they contract out the operations and the running of the network. We don't have. I mean, there are networks across the country that are run by municipalities. Some of them are quite successful. Utopia Fiber in Utah is one. Our towns are tiny, right? And I don't think any of them. They have a hard time plowing their roads. They don't want to be owned. They don't want to be running a network.
Well, having worked for a couple of those that do run them, I can understand why they don't want to run them. It's a lot of work and it's a big lift. Colorado also a state without restrictions on municipal broadband operation, except that a referendum needs to be passed to opt out of the law that says you can't, right, Antonio? I can't remember.
Right.
what
Back
name
in
of that law is.
2005, we did have over 100 municipalities that elected to opt out. But yes, there's still the need for further legislation for other communities to opt out. If I could add on to what Peggy mentioned as well, though, we do have a program, but we primarily require that if we're going to fund a study, that it has to be an area that is unserved, not even underserved is something that we would support, but unserved areas that are completely have no broadband access. We have funded studies in the past through our broadband deployment board.
I want to talk a little bit about the definition of served, because this is a bit of a pet peeve to, well, I think to Todd and I both and others that are involved in the industry. The definition of served that we look at today is entirely based on speeds offered at the end user premise and does not take into account any of the other important factors that come to broadband service, especially reliability, affordability. Has there been any discussion in any of your states about how to create a definition of served versus unserved that takes more factors into account?
In Iowa, we're not looking at that entire list of factors, but we have added into the definition of served, in addition to speed, that the service is available to you in a commercially reasonable time at a commercially reasonable price. And
Right.
so obviously that's, the legal loopholes, what's commercially reasonable, but it does lay a foundation for us to say, if you can facilitate to this person, you have to be able to do it in a reasonable amount of time. It can't be you're down the road and then they need to pay another $22,000 to hook up to the service. Right. So we are adding some of those things in, but we have room to grow in terms of our definition, like a lot of folks do.
Great.
Yeah, I think we all do. In our rule, we have included what we call common use applications, and that's an attempt. We haven't done it yet, but it's an attempt to move away from a definition of speed and latency and all that stuff to a definition of what is it people use and what is it people need to actually do these common use applications. And they include things like telemedicine, gaming, how people use the internet. And so the hope is that in a few years we will move to a definition around served that takes into consideration not the speed, because that's where everybody gets hung up, but really what is people's use of this and how do we make sure this network is usable?
And I understand that's a tougher one to handle, right? It's easy to see an advertised speed because it's just a number on a piece of paper, whereas downtime and things like that can be considered very subjective, and you don't always know the source of that reliability issue. It may be the provider, but it may be the consumer. It may be something in the home or business in the wiring that prevents them from getting reliability. So that's a tough one, but I know that whenever we talk to communities, one of the biggest pain points we hear is reliability is not what they expect. And it's fast when it's working, but it's not working enough.
And as much trouble as we have getting locational data out of providers, they're never going to give us that.
No,
right? They're never going to tell us, because they don't tell the communities this either. I mean, they're never going to tell us, listen, you guys are all on a coax network, which means you sort of share the service, which means if you get a lot of neighbors using it, you might have some slowdown. They will never tell you that. They're certainly never going to report that.
Right.
Right.
I know.
Nor accuracy of speeds. They'll never give us accurate speed data. We test ourselves.
Do you, when it comes to your mapping or any of the elements of your programs that you use to decide who gets or doesn't get funding, do you take consumer reports into account? In other words, if an area is advertised as having 25x3 available, but you're getting all these people calling you saying, I've never had a speed test over 10 meg. Do you take that into account when you're evaluating whether that area is going to be available for funding or not?
In Iowa, the short answer is yes. So we have the ability to accept that citizen feedback as part of the mapping process. We also reserve the right for ourselves to deem an area materially underserved, which has a legal definition that essentially says, services reported to be there, but for this list of problems, as a practical matter, it's not there. So we do consider some of those things.
Great.
Yeah,
Peggy or Antonio?
Yeah, we have the same ability in our rule to declare areas as unserved. We declare them unserved.
Okay.
And we do it through we take input from a whole variety of things: community plans, the state broadband availability map, better data that the companies provide us, speed test data. So we look at all of those things before we declare an area as unserved, and the areas that we declare sort of as unserved are then eligible for funding. The other thing that we do, and it's required in our statute, is that a project has to talk to the incumbent provider if they're not the incumbent provider, but they have to talk to the incumbent provider to see if that provider has any strategy to build out within the same time period as the grant, which is usually a year. So they have to ask the provider, you serve this area, you don't provide adequate service. Are you going to build this area out in a year? And if the provider says no, then they can apply for a grant. If a provider says, yes, we're going to come in and build that area out, they're not eligible for a grant, but we still need to figure out that last piece, right? How do we hold that provider accountable for what they said they were going to do in that year?
That has to be more of a challenge because I don't know what it's like elsewhere, but here in Iowa, we just have the incumbent providers refusing to build out a basic cable plant to subdivisions that were getting built brand new $400,000 homes. They just refuse to provide the money to do it. So then now we're having to go back and clean it up using public funds, and these providers don't seem to want to be accountable that they left the 40 or 50 home subdivisions to depend on DSL. Have you guys seen any of that interactions? Like, you've been difficult to work with, and now we need you.
We have subdivisions that are they're older, right? And then so one of the problems is that when they were built in the 80s, everybody loved underground power, right? So they built underground power, and they ran a very tiny little piece of conduit for the DSL, and now that for them to provide anything other than that inadequate DSL, they have to dig it all up, and so it's very expensive. One of the things that we've talked about doing is in town's comprehensive plan or in their planning ordinances or in their planning process to include a requirement for new subdivisions, obviously, of bringing high-speed connections in. It's sort of a strategy about when you're going to build out a subdivision, you have to meet, sewer, water, but you also have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And in Colorado, during our board process, similarly, we do take a look at every application's financials in the background of the service provider. We have some very small firms. Sometimes it's just one or two people that are trying to provide service in certain areas, but some of them have not got good consumer ratings, and or some of them are not financially viable and such that we give them state or federal funding to try to do a build out. So that's something that we scrutinize through our board process.
Iowa has some similar provisions in its program where we can look at the background and history of the firm, and certainly we can look beyond the four corners of an application to understand whether there's a problem there that may merit some additional consideration.
Now we're talking about state programs here, and again, we're really lucky to have representatives of the state programs in Iowa, Maine, and Colorado with us this afternoon. But your state programs do not operate in a vacuum, as we know. Layered up on top of that, we have federal programs for funding, and those funding programs are potentially going to continue with more funding streams coming down the line. There's been a lot of attention in the past 6 months or so paid to the last federal funding through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and in particular the fact that there were a large number of census blocks where companies received very large amounts of money, but spread over very great areas to build broadband. And there are concerns that some of those companies, if they're actually going to be able to deliver what they have applied for and said they are going to be able to deliver, do those federal grants that are out there, RDOF, CAF2, others, how do they impact your state programs planning for where to deploy much more limited state resources?
So because we have this piece in our statute that says if they're not going to build in the same time frame, we can build over an RDOF area. We don't really consider satellite service adequate. So in our RDOF auction, a big chunk was awarded to our incumbent provider, who is going to be working over the next 6 years to build that out with gig service. We have another smaller provider that is expanding their footprint with gig service. And then just like the previous auction, the 603 CAF auction, a chunk of Maine got awarded to satellite companies. In this case, it was Starlink, which is still in its beta phase. The FCC right now is doing their final review of the long forms and the projections, and they still need to make a determination on all of these bids, whether the company is capable of doing it, whether it meets their standards, and whether they're going to award the funding. So until that actually happens, I think it's a little premature to say sort of what is actually going to fall into the states. We fully expect the Consolidated Communications to be awarded the funding, and certainly Pioneer is going to be awarded the funding. But we actually have a wireless provider who is already trying to sort of turn back the funding because they bid on an area that has a municipal network. And they know they're not going to be able to build out. I mean, the municipal network is $30 a month, and it's a gig service to everybody in town. And so they're pretty sure they're not going to pick up any customers there. So they're already trying to sort of say, oops. But we'll see. I mean, and we'll see what the FCC does. The FCC has a history, I will say, the FCC has a history of looking the other way on many things. And I think Colorado is an example with I think it's CenturyLink or Frontier or one of those two, where they have not met their CAF2 obligations. And the FCC sort of winked a nod. And I certainly hope the FCC stops doing that, because it's ratepayer money, right? It's USF funding, it's ratepayer money. And if somebody bids on an area and essentially blocks it off from any other federal funding and most state funding, then they should follow through on the obligations and build what they said they were going to build.
Yeah, I think that chilling effect is a big concern that a lot of providers have. For example, here in Iowa, as Matt knows, we've got over 100 small independently owned telecommunications companies, many of whom have already built fiber out to their entire exchanges. They would like the opportunity to grow and expand into some of these areas, but when they look and see that a company out of Texas that has only ever served a customer with wireless is saying that they're going to build gigabit low latency there, they're like, what do we do? Do we still try to do this, or are we going to get cut out of this? So how do you, Matt?
The RDOF auction was hard. I think a lot of the areas went way under what the reserve price was.
Yes,
which made
definitely.
it very hard for the little incumbent provider who really has the cheapest pathway to build out better service to that area. They have the cheapest pathway. They have the customers already. They own the poles. They have the cheapest pathway. It made it impossible for them to bid on it. And that, I think that was a huge problem with that FCC program. And I sincerely hope if they're going to build out another, whatever, $11 billion left in that program, that they look at that and figure out a better way to do that.
That's one of the conversations we have as CBAN. That is, when we first were thinking about forming it, we talked to some middle mile providers especially, and they said the value of a map is both to figure out where you want to go and where somebody else is going.
Yeah.
And if we can have that conversation, so your maps are all playing that role too. So we'd like to communicate that we have lots of conversations with communities about, well, what do you really think is going to happen just south of Ottumwa that's going to impact Ottumwa? And what do you really think, And so we go back to, the state maps and say, well, let's look at all these layers and see who the players are and what their barriers are going to be or something like that. And those discussions are going on routinely now.
Yeah.
As communities try to position for this funding and also for the providers.
I mean, from Iowa's perspective, I think when we look at the ongoing challenges with the federal money and different programs doing different things, what we've tried to set up in state laws is just a general relationship to federal money, where if you, an applicant, are a beneficiary of a federal program, Iowa's perspective is fantastic. Let's see how we can match some of those funds together with some of our funds, and let's try to build that multi-sourced funding strategy to do a project, because we think a lot of this is going to happen through the combination of different funding sources. So with respect to the RDOF money that's come into the state, or any CAF or USDA Reconnect or any of those programs, we're not going to provide a penalty in our program to that provider. What we look at from an eligibility standpoint is the service exists today. And with RDOF, some of these timelines are so long, we'll have multiple maps before they'll ever be serviced there. And of course, I'm aware that, there are questions about the ability of some of that build out to occur at the incentive levels that were bid. But we're going to ask what's there today. So the map that we're releasing on July 1st is going to be what's service as of July 1st. And a lot of these newer RDOF programs aren't going to be built by then. So RDOF areas aren't going to be exempted from state funding for that reason. And if someone happens to bring in RDOF, or they happen to bring in even ARP, they've got some local funding, we'll give them more points in our program, because we see that as an opportunity to build a coalition around your project. We are, which in some respects is the reverse of what the federal government's doing in a lot of cases, where they'll say, the one that I, still am smarting from is the USDA Reconnect program, where, they wanted to carve off state funded areas. Like, hold on, our early programs were only 15% match.
Right.
When you want to carve that out. And so we're hoping to see, and we have a chance to talk about this with our federal folks, try to urge the federal government to think about this differently. So it's not so much of a contentious thing, but how can we work together collaboratively to solve some of this?
And I'll just say for Colorado, we generally don't go into the RDOF areas. We generally try to put our state funding elsewhere for the most part.
Okay, great.
Can you describe a little bit about how your offices do interact with your federal delegation? We've had the privilege of having one of our congresswomen, Cindy Axne, who's on one of the federal task force. She was honored as a guest to describe that. But then it's been interesting for Curtis and I to try to figure out how to get comments back to our federal delegation. Do you just directly have their office, or?
Yeah, I mentioned when I talked about Colorado that we established actually a federal liaison, and that person is actually responsible for working with our senatorial and congressional offices. So we actually have a pretty good communication. And pre-COVID, we would actually travel back and forth to Washington, D.C. So we probably anticipate that coming again. So right now with the infrastructure bill that's going on, I think it's critical for all the broadband offices to have a foot in the door, because if you look at what the agreement that Mitt Romney talked about last week coming through, part of what they were going to cut is some broadband funding. So we want to make sure that all of our delegations are in sync in terms of keeping that as part of infrastructure.
Yeah, for Iowa, similarly, we have we've got federal liaisons that are working as a part of their ordinary business on behalf of the state of Iowa, DC. So we have the opportunity via those channels to interact with our congressional delegation and do so routinely.
Yeah, we're probably like Iowa. There's 4, right? There's 2 senators and 2 reps. We're pretty small, and we're almost on a first name basis. I will have to tell you that the representative that works with Senator King and I have a continual message, Facebook message going on what's going on in Congress. And actually, Senator King and Senator Bennett have worked very closely on a bill that just introduced today called the Bridge Act, which I know Teresa's worked very closely on in Colorado, which provides a direction for the new American Jobs Plan, which essentially says provide the money to the states to fund the state programs rather than run these things through the federal programs and have these weird layers, right? Just let's fund the state programs that are closest to the problem. And so we work very closely with our delegation on that kind of stuff. And part of that is because, it's a small state, we're essentially on the first name basis with all of them. And, because there's only 1,000 people in Maine. We all know each other. And so I think it's a really critical element to maintain that conversation, because it's really important that, I was actually testifying in front of Congress this morning for our second congressional delegation representative. And the representative from Michigan was talking about how Minnesota doesn't allow municipal broadband, so therefore the president's plan wouldn't work well. And I'm like, wait a minute, Minnesota has co-ops everywhere. And that's really who's expanding in Minnesota is co-ops, electrical co-ops, farm co-ops, and those do fit the qualifications that Biden is looking for. So it's important for the state office to have a continual conversation with their reps so that they understand the context of what's actually happening in their state. And they can then think about how that works for federal law.
Well, I have to tell you, as one somewhat biased person, I love the idea of the federal funding coming to the states so that state programs can decide where to best invest those funds, because you all have the boots on the ground and you understand your state a lot better than someone in Washington or an analyst for the FCC.
Yeah, and I think that, so the Bridge Act does that. There's been an interest on, I think the LIFTAC has a little bit of money going to state broadband. And actually, one of the people on this hearing was a guy from Texas who has implemented a bill to expand, to provide the federal money directly to state programs. So there's some interest in that Congress sort of understands that these states are really doing this work.
Now,
the challenge is always, or has been, I think, it's such a technical topic that it's to have somebody inside the office that they can become a point person with. And so that's why I was curious to see how that communication pattern happens, because, we wouldn't expect everybody to be a broadband expert, but it almost takes one. And I really applauded right out of the gate that, here being an Iowan, that it's like, I used to be the network engineer / chief financial officer for cities, so, to put a technical person in charge of this, I think was great. Because it's the nuance of the technical aspects of it, as well as the policy aspects that get things done.
Yeah, I'd copy Todd on that, Matt, not to butter you up too much, but I think your office does an excellent job administering your programs. And you have a really good staff, and they do bend over backwards to make these projects work. So kudos to you. And I'm sure, Peggy, your staff is fired up and ready to go. And I'm sure part of it's because they live and work in the state you're in, and they care about making things better in your state. So that's why I love the idea of that funding being administered at the smallest level possible.
Yeah, I think all my folks would tell you this is personal for us. So we really want to see it done and done well, and we want to get people connected because we're living that life. So,
well, so now is really the time to talk with your reps about this, right? Because
it is.
This I don't know when they're going to move this American Jobs Plan forward, but we'll have some component of broadband. And while everybody's focused on the amount, how it's distributed really, really matters.
Yes, it does.
Matters,
One of the things we're working on next is reaching out to county governments or through like the Association of Counties on how to interpret the COVID relief dollars that apply to broadband, and try to interpret that with how do you layer some of these things in on best practices. So because that's going to be universal across the country. And so we've had to work to try to build some liaison back to get. We presume there'll be another round of guidance from Treasury specific to that as people start coming up with ideas on what they're going to do. But again, those are going to be a combination of state, local, and blending that federal.
Yeah, it's hard to know right now with the interim final rule what's in, what's out. I was asked the other day, can it pay for mapping? And I can't. I mean, I'm really not going to give advice to anybody on interpreting error to begin with, but it's hard to know, at this point.
Yeah, we're trying to work with our counties. I mean, our counties, Maine, New England in general, has pretty weak county structure, right? We're very focused on the towns. And so our counties essentially run a jail, have a sheriff's office, register deeds, and probate. That's it. That's what they do. And my county has an average budget of about $12 million a year. They're getting $23 million in this American Rescue Plan. So,
Whoa.
how the funding can be used to improve broadband is really important.
Yeah. We're hoping people say we don't know versus I read that and you can't do that. And that becomes a baseline that you have to we want to make sure there's a broadband community that we're not doing that we're trying to funnel information where it can be. Because I think people will get creative. I think there's some ways to really help get some networks built through some connection fees. It could be direct grants, disadvantaged populations. There's different ways I think that we'll be able to look at that and say that's how you get a network built in that town.
Yeah.
It seems to me, at least the interim rules do put some trust in those county officials or city officials to do what they feel is best to the people they serve. So hopefully that means they will have the flexibility to apply and make creative solutions that are actually going to, make a difference in their areas. So, before we go here, any thoughts from either of you? I would just like to throw this out, maybe as a closing thought. What are the barriers you see to your programs being successful moving forward?
Money.
You could probably use some of that 100 million that Matt got thrown at him here.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a significant, we have two, I mean, money is a challenge. We're a state agency, so we have what's called headcount. We've only have 2 people. We're trying to figure out with contracting, how we work around that. But those are our challenges are resources. We have a demand, we have built a pipeline. Our challenge is how we fund that pipeline.
Yeah.
How about you, Matt?
From my standpoint, I think that there are a couple things. The first one is from the infrastructure side is going to continue to be mapping and trying to decide how we reflect accurately the progress that we're making, the level of geographic granularity, what the FCC is going to provide to us when versus what we're doing internally. That's going to remain a long-term problem. And then I think secondarily is starting to think beyond the provision of connectivity to how we support these users who, confronted with this technology maybe for the first time, may not all be uniformly equipped to make the best use of it. So how do we provide those supports from a digital skills standpoint and affordability standpoint so that they can really use the internet to improve the conditions of their lives, which is part of the reason that we're doing this. So those 2 things are the big things for me.
Great. Well, we want to really thank you all for being part of our little discussion here today. Again, our panel, Matt Behrens, who is the CTO for the state of Iowa, Peggy Schaffer, Director of Connect Maine, and a little bit earlier, Antonia Martinez, Executive Director for Colorado Broadband Office. He had to jump off to another call. Lots of things going on in Colorado today. So we appreciate him taking the time to be part of this, and want to thank everybody who's joined us here and all the CBAN members and associate members who help make all this possible. We'll be back with another CBAN Lunch and Learn next month, and we'll be sending out information on the topic and getting that to you here shortly. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.